Hey everyone. Last week I ran an encounter for my group that was made of wind and leaf and lots of fey magic energy with a creature that I have kind of mostly created myself, or tweaked to be mostly original now. And then I saw Matt Colville's video about action oriented monsters, and I thought, wow, I think I can finally add to a conversation that's happening about DMing. So that's really exciting. I'm a fairly new DM. It started last year, and I've been consuming a lot of the DMing advice videos on YouTube, like a lot. So Matt Colville, Dungeon Dudes. Oh my God, they're taking 20. They're just so many people who have influenced me, and I think that's that plus practice was why I was able to do an encounter last week that I was so proud of. Uh, and I want to go over some of the things that I think made it really good. A lot of the things you may have already heard of if you've been listening to Matt as ardently as I have. But also there are some things from other DMs and a couple of things of my own that, again, I hope can add to the conversation. Uh, Giving you an outline of the things that I want to discuss about that encounter, there was the aesthetic theme and the location, the objective of the encounter, the tactics, uh, using 4E to make 5E monsters more interesting, which is, I know, a video title of Matt Colville. There's improvising numbers. Uh, there's tailoring the combat to your party. And the last bit, which I feel like is kind of more my own thing, is combat puzzles. Turning a combat into a puzzle for the players to solve. So anyway, before I go into all of this, I just want to talk about the combat itself. The players approached a tree in the Feywild. At this tree was an NPC very near and dear to one of the characters being held captive. They were stopped in their tracks by a creature made of leaf and wind, and she told them that she would not allow them to pass because Queen Titania told her not to. Obviously, the players wanted to, conflict arose, RP, roll initiative. At which point, we had two centaurs show up to back up this creature made of leaf and wind. And it began with the leaf and wind creature creating a wind wall to separate out most of the characters, player characters, from each other, isolating a couple and having the centaurs try to really wail on them. A few of the player characters eventually made their way through the wind wall. They took down the centaurs, focused their attacks on this creature of leaf and wind until she got to a point where she was raging and the wind wall disappeared, and instead from her emerged this blast of wind that just pushed everyone away. Following that, anytime she was hit by force damage in particular, she would retaliate, either just around her or with a distant shot, sending a whole bunch of leaf, twigs, branches just going in to deal damage. On her turn, she would mostly do AoE, just trying to get people away from the tree because that was her mandate. The players realized that she was resistant to non-magical physical attacks, kind of common for a party of level, what are they now? 6 to encounter now. Um, they they realized that necrotic damage and fire damage was doing extra damage to her, so try to get those people in to do more. And eventually they got her to a point where she ran out of hit points basically and died. But this was a good four plus rounds in. I want to say it was on the fifth round. And then they got to the NPC who was being held captive by the tree and rescued him, and it was a nice, epic, meaty battle, boss battle. So, breaking this down, um, let's talk about each element of the fight. The aesthetic theme of it, the whole leaf and wind concept, it came from this Pathfinder pawn that I have, um, which is for the Glashtig, and that's all it was. Now, Glashtig has her own stat block in Pathfinder, which I didn't know of when I first saw this art, and I didn't notice the legs below. All I saw were the leaf and the wind, the leaves and the wind around her. So immediately, in my mind, that became something to build an encounter upon. Later on, when I read about her stat block, I realized, oh, she actually has a tiny cloven foot, which is important if you, I think, actually read how Glashtigs are supposed to function according to the Pathfinder bestiary. But that was not my inspiration. My starting point, the whole aesthetic inspiration for this encounter was leaf and wind. And that's why the location became important. The tree was decided upon after I had figured out that I wanted an encounter with this pawn in there. So I knew that the player characters would try to find the NPC. And so I decided to put the NPC next to a tree where she could do her wind magic. So location, very important to an encounter, and objective, very important to an encounter. These two things I learned from the dungeon dudes. And the objective here was for the players to reach the tree, which is why it made sense for my Glashtig, not really a Glashtig, to have powers that push them away from the tree. Just creating barriers and doing push became very thematically appropriate for the narrative as well, not just for the aesthetic. So I had her, but I had seen enough of Matt Colville's video to know that just having her would not be sufficient. So I also added in these guys. I think they have a different name in Pathfinder, but I just used the Centaur stat blocks from the Monster Manual of 5th edition D&D. And they were sort of both the artillery from the distance, but they could also come in quickly and be the infantry to prevent people from going directly to the Glashtig. So it was they did a dual purpose job because they could attack with with their longbows and also with their hooves. So yeah, any of you who've seen the tactics video by Matt Colville, you know where I'm bringing that terminology from. And also from his video was this whole using 4E to make 5E monsters more interesting. And that I used a lot. I actually followed his advice to the letter and went and bought myself a 4th edition monster manual on a discount. I don't know if you can read it, but it's $10. Oh, there it is. And this has a lot of interesting mechanics. The whole bloodied mechanic is super, how do I say this? Not just interesting, but it's great for hinging your battle around. Because depending on how the battle is going, you can use a bloodied state to increase or decrease the difficulty level of a monster. If, let's say, the PCs were having a very rough time, they were rolling poorly, if they were dying or falling unconscious, then on bloodied, I would maybe have had the Glashtig. Drop my pawn there. I would maybe have the Glashtig go down in damage. I would say that, oh, she's getting weaker. She has been shaken. But instead, they were doing really well. So the Glashtig then, that's when she changed her tactics to doing the wind bursts away from her. And also, I upped the DC from 14 to 16. And I'm of the camp where I tell my players the exact DC when I asked them to roll, so they knew that something was different. And I also narrated it that, oh, she's getting more desperate now. In addition to that, I gave her what is probably, the rest of you might consider, the most controversial part, free reactions. As in infinite number of reactions, as long as the trigger condition was met. And the trigger condition in this case was being hit by force damage. And this is where this sort of ties in with Sly Flourish's advice to review the characters that your players are playing before any session, because I knew that one of my players, he was getting a little bit complacent. He was playing Warlock, so just from the distance, Eldritch Blast, Eldritch Blast. He got into a point where he had started swapping out all his defensive spells for aggressive or utility spells because he just wasn't getting hit enough in the backline. And Eldritch Blast is just so generally useful that I wanted to have one encounter where there was a slight twist to it. So even though the Glashstick was not resistant or immune to force damage, anytime she took it, she would retaliate with an attack. And this could happen any number of times that she was hit with force damage. And they got it. Like, I'm a very transparent DM, so I would say that when hit by the force damage, she channels it and kind of does a Tai Chi thing where it turns that energy against you and then sends a whole bunch of this plant matter, plant debris hurtling towards you. So that was one way where I am now transitioning over to a different point of mine, which is one way that I tailored this combat to my players. And the other way that I did was my players are starting to have very high AC, but the issue is not all of them are starting to have very high AC. So the trouble now is if I have monsters with high +2 attack, then some of them get punished too much while the others don't get punished at all, or very little. So that's something I have to resolve going onwards. But for this encounter, I just made it so that most of the attacks coming in from the Glashstick herself were based off of saving throws. It was strength and dex save, depending on what type of attack you're being hit with. So that made it a nice balance and still added a nice bit of threat. And I improvised a lot of the numbers. So this is something I've been getting more and more comfortable with. This is just going to be a one-off monster. There's not going to be another Glashstick that I can think of in the future. So it's completely okay to not have this written down. Although, again, it's still kind of new DM. I imagine if I wanted to run the Glashstick for another group way in the future, I will probably wish that I had written this thing down. Maybe I will write this down right after this video. So far I've covered the aesthetic theme, the location, objective of the fight, tactics, using 4E to make 5E monsters more interesting, improvised numbers, and tailoring the combat to my particular characters, which are all like techniques I've cribbed from other DMs. The one thing that I feel like I'm building for myself is this idea of the combat puzzle, which is not having puzzles in combat outside of the combat itself, but the combat itself being a puzzle. And the easiest way that I've found to do this is to pump up the monster HP by a fair amount, like at least 3 times what the monster manual would recommend a CR level monster would have for appropriate for this party. Bump up that HP, maybe slightly reduce the damage that the monster deals. This was a 6th level party, but excuse me, I was mostly only dealing 10 points of damage, except for the big burst AoE damage, which I would go up to like 20 maybe. So the HP of the monster is really high, and the damage it deals is kind of low. So you'd start wondering, well, how is this not just a big slog? Well, for one thing, it does a lot of AoE and it does reactive damage. So it that let me spread the damage around so that I was threatening a lot of people pretty evenly. And secondly, the big component of this is adding vulnerabilities. I find that the monster manual does not have enough vulnerabilities, and I think Matt Colville has also mentioned this in one of his videos. So I layered in a fire and necrotic damage vulnerability, which I knew that my players had those tools. So just them trying out but different damage types, they were able to figure out, okay, these are the two types that we have and that we know that she's vulnerable to. Let's pile it on, and that drastically increases the rate at which the classic's HP goes down, and then that's how they managed to kill her before anyone even fell unconscious. Which, you know, I would have liked if at least one of them had gone unconscious, but then again, sometimes a little too nice in spreading out my damage instead of focusing my fire. So yeah, that was how I had a really great encounter with a bunch of improvised stuff, but then a lot of different types of breaking the rules. It sort of in the same vein, like I feel like Matt Colville is doing with the villain actions, where it's breaking the rules, but it's actually just redesigning combat around something that's more exciting. So I loved the encounter that I did last week, and I hope to once again threaten the lives of my player characters next week. Thank you for listening.